Chapter 1. The Girl Who Had No Name Worse. Heaping the cart smelled of wet straw and old blood, and Saren had learned, in her 20 years of surviving, not to ask where the smell came from. She sat in the back with 4 other girls, 2 from Ashrael, 1 from the salt flats near Korath, and 1 who had not spoken since the cart departed the village square at dawn. All of them had been collected the same way, a recruiter in dark wool, a coin pressed into the palm of whoever claimed to own them, and a ride north into the Greywood before they had time to protest or pray. Saren had not been owned. That was perhaps the cruelest part of it. She had been given away by the only person who had ever called her family, her mate, Edric, who had pressed her forward with both hands and smiled with all his teeth while the recruiter counted silver into his palm. She had not cried. She had not screamed. She had simply stepped onto the cart and watched the village shrink behind her, and she had decided, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime being overlooked, that she would not make it easy for whatever came next to destroy her. The recruiter rode up front, speaking to no one. The forest closed over them as the road narrowed. Oaks so old their trunks had grown together overhead, their branches weaving a vault of bare black wood against a sky the color of cold iron. There were no birds. Saren noticed that first. No birdsong. No flutter of wings, no small rustlings in the undergrowth that ought to accompany a forest in mid-autumn. Only silence, deep and deliberate, as though the land itself held its breath. "Where are we going?" asked the girl from the salt flats. Her name was Bryn. She had offered it shyly an hour into the journey, as though uncertain she was allowed to speak. The recruiter did not turn around. "Castle Varric. You'll work in the lower kitchens, the laundry, the stores. Honest work. Better fed than most of you've been." And the king grin-pressed. "We've heard things. You've heard stories. Stories aren't the same as truth." But the recruiter's shoulders had gone stiff, and he did not say another word until the cart emerged from the trees. Castle Varric rose from the ridge like something that had always existed, not built so much as erupted from the stone itself. Its towers twisted slightly as though caught mid-motion, its walls the deep gray of a sky about to break open. It was enormous. It was wrong in a way Saren could not immediately name, the way a shadow falls at an angle that doesn't match any light source in the room. And yet she did not feel afraid. She felt inexplicably, as though she had arrived somewhere. The cart rolled through the outer gate into a wide courtyard where a woman waited with a ledger tucked under her arm and an expression that had clearly never entertained the possibility of warmth. She was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched her brows into permanent faint surprise. "Off," she said, before the cart had fully stopped. "Line up. I'm Marin. I run the household. You'll answer to me, and I answer to no one you'll ever meet. The rules are simple." She began to recite them as the girls climbed down, knees stiff from the long ride. No upper floors after the second bell. No wandering the east wing. No speaking to the king if by some misfortune you encountered him. Avert your eyes, step aside, and be grateful if he continued walking. Do not ask about the sounds you may hear at night. Do not investigate the sounds you may hear at night. Report anything unusual to Marin, and Marin alone. "What kind of sounds?" asked the girl who had not spoken during the ride. Her voice turned out to be low and hoarse as though she rarely used it. Marin looked at her steadily. "The kind that remind you why you stay in your room." Saren said nothing. She was already looking at the castle's windows, the ones that were shuttered, and the ones that were not, and the faint difference in darkness between the two, as though some rooms contained a darkness that was not merely the absence of light. She was assigned to the lower kitchens and the cold stores, which meant the earliest rising and the hardest work and the least contact with anyone of consequence. This suited her. She had spent her whole life in the margins of other people's stories, moving quietly through spaces where she was neither welcome nor unwanted, simply invisible, the way a piece of furniture becomes invisible once it is sufficiently familiar. The other servants were wary, not of the work, but of the castle. They spoke in low voices over the long dinner table in the servants' hall that first evening, and Saren listened without contributing, a skill she had developed young. The king's name was Aldrich. He had ruled for 11 years, since his father died under circumstances no one stated plainly. He did not leave the castle. He rarely left the upper floors. On the nights of the full moon and the 3 nights surrounding it, the castle was locked down from within. The upper corridors sealed, and the household staff who had been here long enough simply went to bed early and put something heavy against their doors, not out of certainty one older woman named Dale said quietly, spooning soup she hadn't touched. Out of habit, the habit of people who had learned that some questions were answered only once, and the answer was permanent. Saren ate her bread and thought about Edric, the ease with which he had handed her away, the coin already disappearing into his coat pocket before she'd reached the cart. She thought about the way he had never once, in 3 years of their bond, seemed to register her as anything other than a problem that could be deferred. She thought, "I will not be deferred again." She went to sleep in a narrow bed in a room shared with 2 other kitchen girls, and the castle settled around her with its strange silences and its distant creaks, and somewhere above her, so far up it might have been her imagination, she heard a sound, not a scream, not quite, more like the sound a man makes when he is trying very hard not to become something else. She lay still and listened until it faded, and then she closed her eyes, and she slept more soundly than she had in years. Chapter 2. What the Walls Remember. Saren had been at Castle Varick for 11 days when she first understood that something in the castle was aware of her. Not the king. Not yet. She had not seen him, had no reason to expect she would. He existed in the upper floors like weather exists in the sky, distant, structural, the context for everything but not a presence you encountered directly. What she felt was something subtler, an attention without a source. She noticed it first in the cold stores 3 days after her arrival. She had gone down alone before dawn to take inventory of the salted meats, a task assigned to her because she was methodical and could be trusted not to steal and did not complain about the dark. The cold stores were cut directly into the ridge, low-ceilinged and damp, lit by a single lantern she carried herself. She had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when the lantern flame bent. There was no draft. The flame simply angled sideways toward the far wall, as though drawn by something, and then returned to upright, and the cold in the room deepened briefly. Not the cold of stone and preserved meat, but something older, animal, the cold of being watched by something larger than yourself. Saren stood very still. Then she continued her inventory. She mentioned it to no one. She did not know what it was, and silence in her experience was safer than speaking the wrong thing to the wrong person. But she began to pay attention. The sensation came back. Not always in the cold stores, sometimes in the laundry room when she was alone, sometimes in the long corridor between the kitchens and the servants' hall, always when she was by herself, always brief, and always accompanied by that sideways attention, that sense of something enormous turning in her direction without quite focusing. On the 8th day, she found the black fur. It was caught on a stone jutting from the wall at the base of the east staircase, a place she passed every morning carrying wood from the outer stores to the kitchen hearths. A single tuft, long and very dark, too coarse for any domesticated animal. She stopped and looked at it for a long moment, then stepped back and took a different route. That night she heard the sounds again from above. Longer this time. A low, continuous sound beneath the ordinary language of a castle settling, rhythmic and deep, the kind of sound that traveled not through air but through stone, as though it originated in the structure itself. Brennan, in the bed nearest the wall, pulled her blanket over her head. Saren sat up and listened. She was not afraid, and she could not entirely explain why. There was something in the quality of the sound, a restraint inside it, a discipline, as though whatever made it was choosing the sound carefully, keeping something larger caged inside something smaller. It was not the sound of a monster, it was the sound of a man fighting one. The distinction seemed important. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to contain something that wanted to break free of you. She knew that feeling in a different key. The years of smallness she had wrapped around herself like armor, keeping the part of her that was furious and capable and worth something, pressed down below the surface where Edric and people like him would never feel threatened by it. She understood containment. She respected it. On the 11th day, Mirren assigned her to carry linens to the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor was not the upper floors. It was technically within the permissible zone. The rule was no higher than the 2nd floor, not no higher than the 1st. But none of the other servants went up unless specifically ordered. And the look she received when she picked up the linen bundle confirmed that this was considered either a promotion or a punishment, and no one was entirely sure which. The 2nd floor was quieter than the rest of the castle. The corridor was wider, the stones better cut, the silence here a different quality. Not the absent silence of unused spaces, but a deliberate silence maintained. Every 10 feet, a torch burned in a bracket, casting steady light. Saren moved quickly. She deposited the linens in the correct cedar chest at the corridor's end, as she had been instructed, and she turned to go. She almost did not stop. She had developed the habit of not stopping, of moving through spaces as though she had permission she had not been given, with the confidence of the invisible. But at the far end of the corridor, where it bent toward the east stair and the absolute prohibition of the upper floors, there was a door that stood very slightly open, and through it came a sound, a breath, measured, controlled, deliberate, the breath of someone who had mastered the discipline of breathing because the alternative was worse. She stood at the end of the corridor and looked at that sliver of open door, and she felt the sideways attention again. Stronger now, focused, no longer ambient, but directed. A single beam of awareness landing on her with the weight of something old and precise. Søren took one step toward the door, then Marin's voice came from the stairwell below, sharp, cutting, calling her name. She turned and went back down the stairs, and she did not look back, but she felt the attention follow her until she was out of range. And even then, in the kitchens with the heat and the noise and the ordinary world pressing in from all sides, she felt the ghost of it, like the warm shape of a hand after the hand has withdrawn. Chapter 3. The night he almost lost himself. The moon was 3 days from full when Marin gathered the household staff in the servants' hall after supper and delivered instructions with the flat affect of someone reading weather reports. All non-essential staff would retire by the second bell. Doors were to be bolted from within. The east and north corridors would be sealed by the household guards at first bell. If anyone heard something during the night, they were to remain in their rooms. Under no circumstances was anyone to investigate. Søren watched the faces around the long table. The older staff, Dale and the 2 men who managed the stables, and the woman named Alla who kept the king's accounts, wore expressions of rehearsed calm. The newer arrivals wore expressions of poorly concealed dread. Bryn leaned close to Søren after Marin dismissed them. "They say he transforms," she whispered, "that the curse makes him into something, not fully wolf, not fully man, something between. Where did you hear that?" "Dale, she's been here 6 years. She says it wasn't always this bad. The curse has been deepening." Søren said nothing. She had been here 11 days, and she had already heard the sounds, and she had already felt the attention that followed her through the cold stone corridors. And she had already stood at the mouth of the open door and understood that the thing beyond it was not the simple monster of stories. She went to her room at the second bell with the other girls. She bolted the door. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not sleep. The castle went quiet in the particular way it did when the ordinary life of the place withdrew and left only what was underneath. The first sounds began perhaps an hour after the bells, below the threshold of language. Not a human sound at all now, but not entirely animal either, something in the space between, a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and arrive directly in the chest. Søren felt it in her sternum, a vibration, low and constant and growing. Then something changed. She could not explain it afterward. She would not try to explain it to anyone, because the only person it seemed important to explain it to was the one she could never tell. But in the deep vibration of the castle's nighttime suffering, there was a shift she felt before she heard it, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm breaks. The sound reached for something, and then, faint and directionless and impossible to pinpoint, it found her. The vibration altered. Fractionally. A note change within it, the way a chord resolves, not completing, not settling, but catching. A single moment of oriented focus amid the chaos. She sat very still and breathed. She breathed slowly, deliberately, as she had heard him breathing measured and controlled behind that slightly open door. She did not know why she did it, she did not know if it helped, but the vibration in the stone did not escalate the way Dale had said it sometimes did, and after a long time, a time she could not measure, suspended in the dark between her 2 roommates' frightened silences, the sounds began to ease, not stop. Never stop entirely, not on these nights, but ease, as though whatever was fighting in the floors above had found some small handhold of control and gripped it. She unclenched her hands and looked down and found that her nails had pressed pale crescents into her palms. In the morning, the castle reassembled itself. Staff emerged from rooms, fires were lit, the ordinary machinery of running a large household clattered back into motion. No one discussed the night before. It was one of those understood silences that Søren had spent her life learning to read. Not ignorance, but consensus. The collective decision to let the night be what the night was and leave it in the dark where it lived. Marin found her in the cold stores before breakfast and told her, without explanation, that she was reassigned, not to the lower kitchens, to the second floor. Saren kept her expression neutral. You'll manage the linen room and the supply closets on that level, Maren said. Her voice was its usual flat, efficient instrument, but Saren caught something else underneath it. Not warmth, not concern, but a very careful attention. You'll take meals in the servants' hall as before. If you encounter the king, eyes down, step aside, Saren said. I remember. Maren steadied her for a moment with the look of someone revising an estimate. You're not frightened, she said. Not quite a question. I am, Saren said. I'm just not new to it. Something in Maren's face shifted almost imperceptibly. She nodded once, turned, and left. Saren stood in the cold stores for a moment after she had gone, feeling the reassignment settle over her with a weight that was not entirely unpleasant. She thought about the sound of his breathing behind the open door. She thought about the vibration that had reached through stone to find her in the dark. She thought, I should be more afraid of this than I am. She picked up her lantern and went back to work. Chapter 4. The scent that could not be unnamed. On the third day of her reassignment to the second floor, Saren saw the king. She had known it was coming, in the oblique way you sometimes know things that logic cannot account for. The attention had been increasing, that sideways awareness that she now understood was not the castle but the man inside it, tracking her through walls and floors with a precision that was not sight or sound, but something older and more absolute. She had been changing the torch brackets in the east corridor, a task that required a small ladder and both hands, when she heard the door at the corridor's end open. His footsteps were almost silent. For a man she had imagined as enormous and terrible, he walked very quietly, each step placed with deliberate care, as though he was always calculating how much force he was using and keeping it less than what he could. Saren stepped down from the ladder. She arranged herself at the side of the corridor. She looked at the floor. She heard him stop. She had expected, in the second before she made herself look at the floor, to be overwhelmed. She had prepared herself for something monstrous. Not the storybook monster of Bryn's whispered descriptions, but something visibly wrong, visibly cursed. The kind of ruined king whose ruin showed in his face. But the fraction of him she caught before her eyes went down. The fraction that would stay with her long after, would come back in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, was none of that. He was tall and very still, dressed in dark wool with no ornamentation, his black hair slightly overlong as though he had stopped caring about it. His hands, visible at his sides, were large and controlled. Every part of him was controlled, with that rigid, meticulous containment she now recognized from the breathing in the dark. And he was looking at her with an expression she did not have language for, not desire, not calculation. Something that preceded both of those, something that looked, in the glimpse she allowed herself before propriety forced her gaze down, like recognition. She stared at the floor. She heard him breathe, once, through his nose, slow and deliberate, that measuring breath she had learned the sound of without meaning to, and she heard something happen to it. A slight involuntary change, the tiniest fracture in the discipline, the silence stretched between them. Your name, he said. His voice was low, roughened, as though he didn't use it much. Saren, my lord. Another silence. She counted her own heartbeats. 11, 12. How long? It wasn't a question. It was a demand for information, stripped of excess words, the kind of utterance made by someone who rarely spoke and did not waste it when he did. 14 days, she said to the floor. He was quiet for so long she began to wonder if she had misunderstood, if he had moved without sound, and she was standing in an empty corridor speaking to no one. But then he breathed again, that same measured breath, and she felt the quality of the attention shift. Look up, he said. She looked up. He was close, closer than she'd understood from the sound of him, perhaps 4 feet away. Having crossed the corridor in silence, his eyes on her with an intensity that should have been threatening and was not, precisely though she could not explain why not. The intensity was not aggression, it was the look of something that has been searching without knowing it was searching, and has found without knowing it would find. His eyes were dark and very steady, and in them she saw what she had heard in the stones on the night of his suffering, the discipline, the containment, and beneath it, the enormous, exhausted effort of a man holding something vast and ragged inside himself by an act of pure and unrelenting will. You were on the second floor, he said, the night of the third. She did not pretend not to understand. Yes, my lord. The linen room? Yes. His jaw shifted. He looked past her for a moment, Not away, but through some middle distance, processing something. It was quieter, he said, so quietly she nearly missed it. Not to her. Or, not only to her, to whatever accounting he maintained of nights and their qualities. Saren said nothing. She did not know what to say, and she had learned long ago that silence was often more honest than a wrong word. He looked at her again. The intensity had not diminished, but it had changed its character. Less searching now, more settled, as though some question had received an answer it did not know it had been waiting for. The knowledge of it sat plainly in his expression, and she understood with a certainty she could not argue away that he was feeling exactly what she felt. The orientation, the pull, the sense of a before and after defined by a single corridor in a cursed castle. I will not, he began. He stopped. Started again. You are safe here. He said it as though he were making a promise, and also as though the promise cost him something to make. As though the words had been chosen carefully from among other possible words, harder words, and these were the ones he could offer without breaking something he was working very hard to keep intact. Then he turned and went back through the door at the corridor's end, and the bolt slid home behind him, and Saren stood alone in the torchlit hall with her ladder and her torch brackets, and the shape of the last 10 minutes settling around her like something that could not be unshapen. She went back to work. Her hands were entirely steady. But the cold stores, that night, smelled not of salt and stone, but of pine forests and something darker, wilder, something she had no name for, the scent of something alive that had stood very close to her, and carried the cold of the grey wood on it, and found her, and promised her safety in a voice that had forgotten how to be easy. Chapter 5. The Curse That Wears a Crown. Saren learned the story of the curse the way she had learned most things in her life. Sideways, in pieces, from people who were not telling it to her, directly. Dale was the primary source, though she did not know she was being listened to. She talked in the evenings in the servants' hall, in the low, patient voice of someone who had arrived at the age where keeping secrets felt like less important work than bearing witness. 11 years ago, King Aldrich had refused a treaty that would have given the Witch Council of the Thornwood governance over 3 of the Northern Pack territories. He had refused it on principle. The council's governance was not governance but harvest, not protection but extraction, and the packs who lived in those territories would have been subject to an authority that saw them as a resource. He had said no with the finality of a man who had been born to say no when it mattered. The council's senior witch, a woman named Verith, had cursed him. Not a simple curse, not a simple affliction. The curse was architectural, built into the structure of his power, his transformation, his bond with his own lycanthropy. On the full moon and the days around it, his control over the shift fragmented. Not fully, he had sufficient will to keep himself from a complete loss of self, but barely and at great cost, and the cost was accumulating. Each month it deepened slightly. Each month the window of control narrowed. The curse also had a secondary element that Dale only mentioned once and then did not elaborate on. Something about the bond, about how the curse affected not just his transformation but his capacity for it. The lichen bond, the mate recognition, the animal instinct that in healthy lichens was a source of strength. He hasn't taken a mate, Dale said, on the night Saren listened most carefully, or been able to. The curse interferes. Any bond he tries to form, the curse poisons it. The woman across from her, Ola, the account keeper, made a sound that was not disagreement but was not agreement either. That's not what I've heard. What have you heard? That the curse doesn't prevent the bond, Ola said carefully. It just means that if the bond forms, the mate is in danger. The curse treats the bond as leverage. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then the king has kept himself from bonding deliberately. At considerable personal cost, Ola agreed. 6 years he's been managing it. Without a mate anchor, his control deteriorates faster. The irony is that the thing that would stabilize him is the thing he won't do. Because doing it would endanger her. Yes, Saren sat very still with her soup, looking at the table, feeling the conversation rearrange everything she had understood about the king and the castle and the 14 days she had spent inside it. She thought about the attention in the cold stores. She thought about the vibration to the stone on the night of the 3rd moon, reaching through walls to find her and catching something. She thought about the corridor and his voice, I will not, and the way he had stopped himself, carefully, and offered safety instead of whatever word had been waiting behind those two. She understood now what I will not meant. She understood what it cost him. The following morning, She went about her work on the second floor with the knowledge pressing down on her like a new weather system, and she did not speak of it, and she did not show it, because she had spent 20 years keeping the things that mattered most to her below the surface, where they could not be used against her. But that evening, passing the door at the east corridor's end, she placed her hand flat against the wood for a single moment. Not a knock, not a gesture he would notice. Nothing that could be read as an action by anyone who might observe it, just the warmth of her palm against the grain of the door. And on the other side, in the silence that was never quite silence in this castle, she felt the attention turn. Focused. Certain. No longer searching. She walked away. Behind her, nothing moved. No bolt drawn. No door opened. He kept his distance with the same disciplined will he used for everything, and she kept hers, and the space between them was thick with things that were choosing, carefully, not to be said. 3 days before the next full moon, a visitor arrived at Castle Varick. He came under the banner of the Southern Pack Council, which Marin announced to the household with the same flat efficiency she used for all announcements, but with a particular compression in her voice that Saren had learned to read as concern. His name was Lord Kenneth. He was broad and brightly smiling, and he had the look of a man who had calculated every expression he wore. He was escorted to the upper floors immediately upon arrival, and the household was informed that additional care was to be taken regarding propriety and comportment during the visit, which Saren understood to mean nothing unusual, nothing personal, nothing that could be reported. She learned from Dale that evening that Kenneth was the council's liaison to Varick, one of the pack lords who had been circling the question of Aldrich's rule for years, watching the curse deepen, making polite inquiries about succession, about stability, about the king's capacity to continue. He wants the throne, Dale said simply. Not openly, he's not stupid enough for that. But the council has the power to declare a king unfit if the evidence supports it, and the evidence, month by month. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Saren looked at her soup and thought, the king is fighting on 2 fronts then. One inside himself, one in the world of men who are waiting for him to lose. Chapter 6. The price of being seen. Kenneth was not what Saren had expected. She had prepared herself for overt malevolence, someone whose corruption was visible, whose intent leaked through his courtly manners like water through cracked stone. She was accustomed to reading people quickly, and she had expected to read him easily. Instead, he was smooth. He was practiced. And his eyes, when they found her in the second-floor corridor on his second morning at the castle, held nothing immediately alarming. "You," he said pleasantly. "What's your name?" "Saren, my lord. You work this floor?" His tone was casual, but the question had a point in it. "Yes, my lord. Supply management and linens." He studied her for a moment with the appraising look of a man cataloging assets. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. "And in that time, have you encountered the king?" Saren met his eyes with the flat, expressionless gaze she had developed young. The face of someone who has decided that being perceived as boring is a form of armor. Once, briefly, in this corridor, he instructed me to return to my duties. Kenneth smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes by quite enough. "Good. That's good." He nodded once, as though confirming something, and moved on down the corridor. She watched him go and felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the stone walls. She went to Marn that afternoon. Marn listened without expression while Saren described the encounter. When she finished, Marn was quiet for a moment. Her stylus paused over the ledger open on her desk. Did he ask anything else? No. But he was watching me. Not, she paused, choosing words carefully, not as a man watches a woman, as a man watches something he's decided might be useful. Marin set down the stylus. She looked at Saren with the revised estimate expression, which was becoming a more frequent occurrence, and said, "You're perceptive." "I've had reason to be." Another pause. Marn was doing some calculation. Saren could see it, weighing something. Measuring risk against disclosure, against the particular practical intelligence of a woman who had kept a cursed king's household running for years on pure competence and fierce discretion. "Kenneth is here to observe," Marin said finally, "to gather evidence of the king's condition, to take it back to the council and argue that King Aldrich is no longer fit to rule." She paused. "If you have had contact with the king, any contact beyond that single hallway encounter, you should keep it to yourself with extreme care. Kenneth will speak to the staff. He will be charming and unthreatening, and he will ask questions that seem innocent. They are not." "I understand," Saren said. Do you? I've been invisible my whole life, Saren said quietly. I know how to stay that way. Something crossed Marin's face, a flicker of something complicated, something that might have been, in another context, something close to grief. Good, she said. That will serve you. A pause. And the king. Saren returned to the second floor and did not seek out the door at the corridor's end, but the attention found her anyway, that evening, with an urgency it had not carried before, sharper, more insistent, asking a question without words. She could not answer it in any way she could explain. She only moved more slowly past that end of the corridor, letting her footsteps be heard, letting her presence register, saying in the only language available to her, I am here. I know. I am not telling. 2 days before the full moon, she found the passage. It was behind a linen rack in the supply room. A door she had assumed was a closet, until she pulled the rack aside to replace a loose shelf bracket and found that the door opened into a narrow passage that smelled of cold stone and the same dark wildness she had first caught in the cold stores 3 weeks ago. She did not go through it. She stood in the supply room with the door ajar, and the passage breathing cold air against her face, and she understood that this had been made for someone to use, or had been found by someone and used, and the smell of it told her clearly whose passage it was. She closed the door. She replaced the linen rack. She did not tell Marin. That night she heard him in the walls, not the pre-moon suffering she had heard before, but something quieter, more controlled. The sound of something large moving through tight spaces with extraordinary care, managing its own size and weight and power with the same deliberate precision it managed everything else. The sound stopped outside her room. She lay completely still. Then they moved on, and the cold stone was just cold stone again, and she stared at the ceiling until dawn grayed the window. And then she got up and went to work. Chapter 7. What the moon demands. She was not there when it broke. She wished afterward that she had been, though the wishing made no practical sense. The full moon rose on a clear night, the sky stripped of cloud by a wind that had been cutting through the grey wood for 2 days, and the castle sealed itself as it always did. Bolts drawn, fires banked, the heavy silence of a household going underground. Saren lay on her bed and listened, and the sounds above her were worse than they had been before. Not worse in violence, not crashing or destruction, nothing that suggested he had lost himself completely. Worse in effort, the sounds of a man at the absolute limit of something, holding a line he had been holding for 11 years against a force that had been pushing continuously, and the line was closer to breaking now than it had ever been. She thought about what Allah had said. Without a mate anchor, the control deteriorates. She thought about the passage in the supply room wall. She got up. She told herself later that she had not made a decision, that there had been no point at which she had weighed consequences and chosen, that she had simply moved, in the way you move when something more fundamental than thought takes over, and the thinking came after the moving rather than before it. She went to the supply room. She moved the linen rack. She opened the passage door. The cold hit her like stepping into deep water. Not unpleasant, but total, surrounding. She took her small candle and she went in. The passage wound upward in a tight spiral, the walls so close her shoulders nearly brushed both sides. She climbed for what felt like a long time, counting her own careful footsteps in the dark, and then the passage widened, and a door appeared in the wall to her left, and she stopped. Through it, the sounds, closer now, no longer mediated by floors and stone corridors, but immediate, the breath of something very large and very controlled and very near the end of its control. She put her hand on the door, her palm flat against the wood, the same gesture she had made below, in the ordinary corridor, the gesture that was not a knock and not a request. The sounds stopped. The silence was so complete it had texture. Then, from the other side of the door, in a voice that barely held its human shape, no. She pressed her hand harder against the wood, not pushing, not demanding, just present. You need to go back, he said. The voice was rougher than she had heard it. The control in it was extraordinary. The effort of maintaining recognizable speech, she understood, was costing him something he could not spare. I cannot, Saren. Her name in that voice, shaped by the edge of something vast and barely leashed, broke something loose in her chest that she had not known was there. I'm not afraid of you, she said, a sound from the other side that was not words. Low, deep, the vibration she knew from the stone, but close now, close enough to feel in her sternum without the mediation of castle walls. You should be, he managed. Perhaps, but I'm not. She pressed her forehead against the door. She did not know where the gesture came from. She did not interrogate it. I can hear what it costs you. I've been hearing it for weeks. I'm not going to pretend I haven't. The sounds from the other side changed. Not escalated, eased. In the way they had eased fractionally on that first night 3 weeks ago when she had breathed deliberately in the dark of her shared room. But closer now, stronger. She stayed until the sounds had gentled to something bearable. She stayed until she heard him sit, the creak of a large body against stone, and the breath begin to regulate. She stayed until nearly dawn. She did not open the door. He did not ask her to. Neither of them spoke again, but the silence between the door and her forehead pressed against it was not empty. It was full of things that had no form yet, only weight. The weight of what happens when two people who have been alone a very long time find themselves on either side of something thin. In the morning she went back through the passage and replaced the linen rack and went to the kitchens and did not tell anyone. But she was different, she could feel it, not in any way that was visible. She moved the same, worked the same, kept the same careful blankness on her face she'd worn for years. But inside her chest, where the part of her she kept pressed down had lived for so long, something had shifted. Something was standing up. Chapter 8. Blood Speaks in Silence. The discovery came from Caniff's man. She had known he had one, a quiet, forgettable person who moved through the castle with the unremarkable efficiency of someone who had been taught how to become background, had to observe without appearing, to observe. Saren had recognized the technique because she had used it herself for years. She noticed him in the supply room corridor on the morning of the 3rd day after the full moon, where he had no reason to be, positioned near the linen rack she had not quite replaced perfectly. She went very still. He noticed her noticing him, and something passed between them. The mutual recognition of two people who understand the same language of invisibility, each aware that the other speaks it, both calculating simultaneously how much of what they knew the other could prove. She moved the interaction along with an inquiry about towel supplies, gave him nothing, and went directly to find Marin. Marin's face, when she heard about the linen rack, went very controlled very quickly. He found the passage, she said. It was not a question. I don't know what he found, but he found something. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then the king needs to know. I can tell him. Marin looked at her. The revised estimate expression had become something else now, something more complicated. The look of a woman who has been managing a situation with great competence and has encountered something she did not account for, and is not sure whether it is a problem or a solution. You've spoken with him, Marin said. Flat, careful. Yes. More than once. Yes. Another silence. And he. She stopped. Started again. How is he with you? Saren thought about forehead against wood. She thought about her name and a voice at the edge of its human shape, and what it had cost him to say it. Careful, she said. He's careful with me. Marin closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, there was something in them that was, perhaps, relief. Go, she said. She went to the 2nd floor. The corridor was empty. She went to the door at the end and knocked. A real knock this time, 3 measured sounds. A pause. Then, come in. He was standing at the window when she entered, looking out over the ridge and the gray distance of the gray wood. He turned when he heard her, and the expression on his face when he recognized her was not surprise. It was the careful thing, the controlled management of something that wanted to be more than it was allowed to be. He was less contained in the daylight than she had imagined, not less disciplined. The discipline was absolute and evident in every line of him, but less shadowy, less mythological. He was simply a man, a very tired man with dark eyes and the bearing of someone who had been in a siege for 11 years and was still standing by an act of will, rather than any particular confidence in the outcome. Thenet's man was in the supply corridor, she said without preamble. He may have found the passage. Something moved in his face. How much does he know? I don't know. But he saw me, and he knows I saw him. Aldrich turned back to the window. His jaw was tight. Kyneth will go to the council. If he can argue that my curse is deteriorating beyond control, that I endangered a member of the household, he stopped. You didn't endanger me. He turned back to look at her. You were in the passage, Saren. I chose to be there. The council won't care about the distinction. His voice was quiet and hard. They'll use it. Any evidence that the bond is forming, that I've been near you, that I can't maintain. He stopped again, this time for longer, and the careful management in his face was doing a great deal of work. She stood in the middle of his room and looked at him steadily, What did Varys' curse actually do? She asked. I've heard pieces. Tell me the whole of it. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed to a chair and sat in it. Not a loss of composure, but a deliberate lowering of himself, as though he was deciding to be less armed for this particular exchange. The curse fragmented my control on lunar peaks, he said. You know that much. What you may not know is that it does something else. It altered my blood recognition. The old lichen ability to recognize a mate's bloodline, the deep genetic resonance that the ancients called moonblood. Varys tried to destroy that ability. He paused. She failed. She didn't destroy it, she made it hypersensitive. Saren went very still. I can smell you from 3 floors away, he said, with the flat directness of a man stating a fact he has been living with for weeks and is tired of not naming. I could smell you the first night you arrived. Something in your blood, I don't know what it is, but it is not ordinary. His eyes met hers, and it is the only thing in 11 months of steady deterioration that has done anything to the curse. The words settled over her. She thought about Edric pressing silver into the recruiter's hand. She thought about a lifetime of being invisible, unremarkable, without surname or lineage or anything that marked her as worth knowing. She thought, he handed me away without knowing what he was handing away. She thought, I did not know what I was either. Chapter 9. The council comes for a king. Taenith moved faster than Saren had expected. Within 2 days of her conversation with the king, riders arrived wearing the crest of the Southern Pack Council, 5 of them, hard-faced men who took rooms in the castle's guest wing with the ease of people who had planned the occupation. Taenith met them in the hall that evening, and the sound of his voice drifting up through the castle's stone was the voice of a man who was done pretending. Meryn convened the household staff the following morning. The council has invoked Article 7 of the Pack Accords, she said. Her voice was its usual efficient instrument. They are entitled to observe and examine a ruling Alpha King if 3 Pack Lords present evidence of a deteriorating condition. Coneth has provided that evidence. There will be a formal examination in the Great Hall tomorrow evening. She did not say. They intend to remove him. She didn't need to. The household moved through that day with the particular charged silence of a place where everyone understands that something irrevocable is about to happen, and no one can stop it through ordinary means. Saren went about her work. She thought very clearly and very fast. She had been handed away by a man who saw her as nothing. She had arrived in a castle whose king kept himself from a bond he needed because the bond would endanger her. She had stood in a passage and pressed her forehead against a door and stayed until dawn, and she had not done that out of duty or obligation or any calculation about consequence. She had done it because he was drowning, and she was, improbably, the shore. She knew what her blood did. She did not fully understand it yet, but she had listened to Aldrich with the focused attention she gave to anything that mattered, and she had understood the shape of it. Her bloodline carried something old, something the ancients had called moonblood, something that acted on his curse like, not a cure, nothing so clean, but a counterweight, a stabilizer, an anchor. Caneth knew some of this. His man had been in the supply corridor. If the council declared Aldrich unfit, they would remove him. Kyneth, with his bright smile and his cold eyes, would step into the power vacuum. And Saren, whose value she now understood in a way she had not understood it before, would either be used or silenced, or both. She went to Aldrich's door at midday and knocked. He opened it, which he had not done before without a pause. I know what I am, she said, before he could speak. Or at least the shape of it, what's in my blood. She watched his face. I want to know if it can help you, tomorrow at the examination. His expression was the careful management, but fraying at the edges. Saren, don't tell me I'm safe. I've been safe my whole life and safety meant invisible. I won't go back to that. The careful management cracked, not broke. He did not have the luxury of breaking things, but cracked, and through the crack, she saw what had been behind it all this time. Exhaustion, loneliness of the particular kind that comes from never allowing another person close, and beneath it like an ember in deep ash, something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly the shape of this moment. The bond will form if you stay close, he said. His voice was very low. The curse treats it as leverage. Being my mate will put you in danger. Being unremarkable and invisible put me on a cart, she said. Someone else's danger, not my own choice. I choose my own. He was very still. Let me stand with you tomorrow, she said, not behind you, with you. Something in the great tired architecture of his self-containment shifted. Slowly, irreversibly, the way a glacial thing shifts when the long pressure of years finally finds its angle. You don't know what you are, he said quietly. The full extent. No. But you can tell me. You may not like what it means. Tell me anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, then he stepped back from the door and let her in. Chapter 10. What bonds cannot be burned. The great hall of Castle Varric had not been used for any formal purpose in 11 years. It showed. The long tables had been uncovered and hastily dressed with whatever the household could arrange, and the torches in the iron brackets along the walls threw light that was more shadow than illumination, which Saren suspected was not accidental. The council lords sat at one end in a line, 5 of them, with Kenneth at the center, and the careful arrangement of their seating conveying the tribunal nature of the occasion without anything so crude as a judge's bench. Aldrich entered from the far door. He wore black, as he always did, but this evening the black had the quality of armor, not ornamental, but absolute, the choice of a man who had decided that this was what he was, and the world could take it or not. He walked the length of the hall without hurry, without display, with the contained force of someone who has been underestimated for years and has stopped being surprised by it. Saren walked 2 steps behind him. She had not announced she would do this. She had simply done it. And he had not told her not to. She watched the council lords' faces when they saw her. Taina's smile thinned very slightly. The lords on either side of him exchanged a glance. Good, she thought. Let them look. The examination proceeded with the formal language of the pack accords. Questions put to the king about his capacity, his control, his recent lunar cycles. Kind of presented his evidence, the testimony of his observer, details about the passage, indirect evidence of a bond forming outside the sanctioned processes. He was not wrong about any of it. He was using correct facts to build a story that served him. Saren stood 2 steps behind the king and was absolutely still and let them look. When Kenneth finished, the lead council lord, an older man named Trev, who had the look of someone who had been administering difficult decisions for so long they no longer disturbed him, turned his gaze on her. The servant girl, he said, you've been identified as a potential mate bond. Do you understand what that means? I understand what Lord Kenneth wants it to mean, Saren said. Her voice was steady. The great hall had the particular acoustic quality of high stone walls, and she did not need to raise it. He wants it to mean that the king has compromised himself, has formed an unauthorized bond that destabilizes his rule and provides grounds for the Article 7 examination. Drev raised an eyebrow. And what do you say it means? She stepped forward. 1 step only, coming level with the king, and she felt him, beside her, not look at her, look forward, straight, with the contained precision of someone who is allowing something to happen and managing the allowance very carefully. The king has not formed a bond, she said. He has resisted forming one, at considerable personal cost, specifically to protect me from the leverage the curse would use against him. I know that because he told me. I know that because I have observed him for weeks, and the observation matches the claim. She paused. What Lord Kenneth is asking you to penalize is not instability, it is control, exceptional control. The kind of control that refuses a bond it needs in order to protect someone who does not rank high enough, in Lord Kenneth's accountant, to be worth the protection. The hall was very quiet. Furthermore, she said, and now her voice had something in it she had spent 20 years keeping pressed down, something fierce and undeferred. If the council is interested in the question of bloodline and moonblood, and what that means for the curse's trajectory, I would suggest that removing the king and installing Lord Kenneth would solve nothing. The curse is anchored to Aldrich's line. Removing him doesn't end it, and the moonblood that has been acting as a counterweight to its deterioration. She looked at Kenneth directly. Belongs to me, not to the council, not to Lord Kenneth, to me. Kenneth's smile was entirely gone. Lord Drev studied her for a long time. He was the kind of man, she thought, who had seen many things in many great halls and was currently recategorizing what he was seeing. Who are you? He asked. Saren, she said. I have no surname, not yet. Aldrich, beside her, made a sound that was very quiet and entirely involuntary, not shock, not surprise, but the sound of something like recognition, the sound of a man hearing something said aloud that he has been thinking for weeks. Drev looked between them. He looked at the council lords on either side of him. He looked at Kenneth, who was very still with the stillness of a man whose calculation has encountered a result he did not prepare for. "The examination," Dreb said finally, "will be postponed pending further inquiry into the bloodline question." He paused. "The council does not remove kings on incomplete evidence." Another pause longer. "And the evidence I have seen here tonight is incomplete in ways that appear to serve Lord Kaint's interests, rather than the Accords." Kaint said nothing. He was looking at Saren with the cold-eyed attention of someone who has been outplayed and is already calculating the next move. She met his gaze and held it, and she did not look away, and after a moment, it was he who looked down. Chapter 11. The mate, the curse, could not break. The council departed the following morning. Not all of them. Lord Drev remained with one of his colleagues for what he described as a courtesy visit to review the bloodline question in more depth. Kenneth left with the others, and the castle watched him go with the collective breath release of a household that has been holding itself together through something difficult and can, very slightly, let go. Marin found Saren in the supply room, where she had returned to ordinary work because ordinary work felt necessary, felt grounding, felt like herself, and stood in the doorway for a long moment. "He wants to speak with you," she said. Saren set down the ledger she had been reviewing. She went to the second floor. The door was open. He was standing at the window again. The grey wood spread out before him in the thin autumn light. He turned when she entered, and the careful management was still present. It would always be present, she understood. It was part of how he was built, but it had changed. The crack she had seen the day before had not closed. He was not sealing it. "The council will investigate the bloodline," he said. "Drev is thorough. He'll find what there is to find. It may," he paused, "change how the castle is perceived. How you are perceived. I know. It will make you a target. If Connus understands the full extent of what your blood can do." "He already suspects it," she said. "He suspected it before I did." A pause. "That's why he wanted me visible. At the examination, he wanted the bond to look reckless, to look like your loss of control. He didn't understand that naming it wouldn't make it his." Aldrich was very still. "No," he said quietly. "It wouldn't." She crossed the room. Not quickly, not with urgency or need, but with the deliberate calm of someone who has been making her way toward something for weeks and has arrived. She stood before him, and he looked down at her with the expression that had no name she had been given yet, the expression that had been in his face since the corridor and the torch brackets and the words of safety offered at cost, and she put her hand on his arm, just her palm flat against the dark wool of his sleeve, the way she had put it flat against the door. His breast changed. The discipline was present, absolute, but it was working to allow something now rather than contain it, a different kind of control, precise and careful, but not locked. "The bond," he said. "Lo, if it forms, the curse uses it as leverage," she said. "I know. Tell me what that means." "Exactly. It means Verit's curse will try to hurt me. Through you." His voice was very careful. "It means anyone who discovers the bond can use you as a point of pressure." A pause. Longer. "It means you will not be safe the way you were safe before." "I told you," she said quietly. "Safe the way I was before was not a life I would return to." He looked at her for a long time. The window light behind him was flat and grey, and the grey wood was bare and dark at this time of year, and the castle was very still. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It cost him something to say it. The admission of not knowing, from a man who had been managing every dimension of an impossible situation through pure will, was the kind of honesty that only happens when the armor comes off. "I've been." He stopped. "I've been alone a long time, and I have made that a discipline." "I know," she said. "I have too. You deserve someone who isn't fighting a witch's curse on a monthly basis." "Probably," she agreed. "But I appear to be here." Something moved in his face, complicated and very human, and then, slowly, with the careful deliberation he gave to everything, he placed his hand over hers on his arm. Just that. The weight of his hand over hers. The bond did not announce itself in fire or light, or any of the dramatic manifestations of Lycan lore. It moved through her the way the vibration moved through stone, not heard but felt, deep and specific, settling into the marrow of her with the particular quality of something that was always going to happen, was always going to be her, and had simply been waiting for the right door to open. She felt his breath catch. She felt the curse. She would not have been able to describe it afterward, but she felt it. The Thornwood Witch's old malicious architecture pressing against the bond with the automated cruelty of a trap sprung. She felt it press, and she felt her own blood rise to meet it. The moon blood that Verith had not known about. The bloodline she had not known about. The thing in her that Edric had handed away on a cart for a handful of silver, not knowing what he held, not worth knowing. It held. The bond held. The curse pushed and the moon blood held it, not breaking the curse. Not yet, not simply, but meeting it, matching it, refusing it, the ground it needed to become leverage. Aldrich's exhale was the longest she had heard from him. Slow, unguarded. Saren, he said, her name again in that voice. Not at the edge of its human shape now. Fully human, fully human, fully him. I know, she said. He bent his forehead to hers. Not a kiss, not yet, nothing so declarative, just the pressure of his forehead against hers, the same gesture she had made against the door, returned. They stood there in the gray window light while the gray wood spread out cold and bare before them, and the castle was quiet, and the bond settled into both of them like a root finding water. Chapter 12. The Queen the King did not know he needed 6 weeks later. Lord Drev returned to Castle Varick. He came with 3 clerks and a scholar from the old Moonblood archives in the Eastern Territories, and he came with the expression of a man who has spent 6 weeks discovering something that has rearranged his understanding of a situation he believed he understood. He met with Aldrich first. Surin waited in the second-floor corridor with her hands folded, maintaining the habit of patience that had carried her through 20 years of being overlooked, except that the patience now had a different quality to it, grounded, steady, connected to something below her that was solid. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When Aldrich came to the door at the corridor's end, he had the look of someone who has received news of great magnitude and is still integrating the shape of it. "Come in," he said. She went in. The scholar from the archives was a small woman who looked at Saren with the focused intensity of a person who has been told about a thing and is now encountering the thing and finding the encounter stranger and more significant than the telling. Her name was Fea, and she had spent, she told Saren, 30 years cataloging what remained of the old Moonblood lineages. "Your mother's line," Fea said carefully. "We traced it. You have no surname because the lineage was erased, deliberately after the Thornwood Purge. There were families who carried the old healer blood, the resonance blood, what the Lycan ancients called the calming thread. Varys' council persecuted them. The ones who survived did so by disappearing." She paused. "You are what is left of one of those families?" The room was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Saren said carefully. "For the curse?" Fea looked at Aldrich. Some exchange passed between them. The look of people who have already had the difficult part of this conversation. "Moonblood in the direct proximity of a cursed Lycan king," Fea said. "Particularly a king whose curse was placed by the same tradition that persecuted the Moonblood lineages. There is precedent. Not many cases. The archives are incomplete. But what there is suggests." She paused again, with the careful precision of a scholar who refuses to overclaim that prolonged close presence, compounded by a recognized mate bond, can degrade the curse's architecture. Not immediately, not without cost, but progressively. Saren sat with this. "It can be undone," she said, "in time, with considerable difficulty, and only while the bond remains intact and active." Fea folded her hands. The curse would fight the process. The Thornwood Witch built it to last, but she did not account for the Moonblood because she believed she had eliminated it. She was wrong, Aldrich said quietly. He was looking at Saren with an expression she had begun, over the past 6 weeks, to recognize. Not the careful management, not the discipline of containment. Those were still there. They would always be there. They were built into him. But beneath them, steady and unglamorous and real, the way he looked at her when they were alone, and he had allowed the crack in the armor to stay cracked. Lord Drev cleared his throat. "There is also the question of the council," he said. "Given the bloodline documentation and what it means for the curse prognosis, the Article 7 case is dismissed, formally and permanently." He paused. "As for Coneth, leave Coneth to me," Aldrich said. His voice was quiet and final. Drev nodded once, without argument. When the scholar and the clerks had withdrawn and Drev had excused himself with the tact of a man who understood that the remaining conversation was not for him, Saren stood in the middle of the room with the weight of everything she had just learned settling into her bones. She thought about the cart, the white straw and old blood, the coin pressed into Edric's palm, the grey wood closing overhead in a vault of bare black branches. She thought about the cold stores and the lantern flame bending, about the door she had knocked on, in the dark. She thought about her whole life being precisely the shape it needed to be, to bring her to this room, in this castle, beside this man, not as a destiny she had been written into, not as someone else's salvation, that she had been assigned without consent, but as the accumulation of every choice she had made from the smallest possible position, with no power and no name and no one who thought she mattered, until she had arrived at a place where she chose the thing that mattered most. "You are thinking loudly," Aldrich said. He had come to stand beside her without her hearing him, the way he always moved, with the silent precision of something that was many things at once and had learned to carry all of them carefully. "I'm thinking about Edric handing me onto a cart," she said, "and how he thought he was disposing of a problem. He was wrong." "Yes," she looked up at him. "He handed away someone who would become a queen." The word offered quietly in the winter light landed in the room and changed the air of it. Aldrich looked at her for a long time. The expression she was learning, steady, unglamorous, real, was fully present, nothing managed about it. "That depends," he said, "on whether she wants to be." She thought about want. She thought about a lifetime of wanting nothing, or wanting things so small they couldn't be taken from her, and the specific discipline of that smallness, the armor of it. She thought about what it felt like when the armor came off. "I want to be here," she said. "Specifically here. The title is secondary. Then stay." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, simply, without excess, with the weight of a man who has learned that plain words are more honest than decorated ones, and who has spent 11 years fighting for the right to keep offering them. She stayed. The bond between them deepened in the weeks and months that followed, not in sudden revelations, but in the accumulation of ordinary days, each one laying down something that would take years to fully understand. He learned, slowly and with great care, how to allow someone close. She learned, with equal slowness, how to inhabit space that was genuinely hers, how to take up room, how to have a name that mattered, how to let herself be seen by the one person whose seeing did not diminish her. The curse did not break overnight. Vi had warned them it wouldn't, and she had been right. It retreated in increments, a lunar cycle with less suffering, a month in which the sounds due the stone were quieter, a night when he came to her afterward and his hands were steady and his eyes were clear, and neither of them said what that meant, because saying it might break the fragility of it, but it retreated. Month by month, the Thornwood Witch's 11-year architecture eroded against the thing it had not been built to withstand. The quiet, patient, fierce insistence of a girl with no surname, and the oldest blood in the territories, who had been handed away like something worth nothing and had arrived, instead, as everything. Conith did not come back to Castle Varick. Lord Drev ensured that, in the quiet, efficient way of a man who understood that some problems were best resolved before they required a public scene. Marin, at the end of that first year, came to Saren with a set of household keys. Not a ceremony, not a speech, just the keys laid on the table between them, with the directness of a woman who communicated in actions rather than words. Saren picked them up. She ran the household with the same methodical calm with which she had run the cold stores. Competent, fair, unshowy, noticing everything. The staff, who had watched 6 weeks of the council crisis and knew what had happened in the Great Hall, and had drawn their own conclusions about the girl with no surname who had stood at the king's shoulder and spoken to 5 council lords without flinching. The staff gave her the particular loyalty that cannot be demanded and cannot be manufactured, the kind that comes from watching someone be genuinely themselves under pressure and finding that the thing they are is worth following. And Aldrich, who was still careful, still disciplined, still the contained and deliberate man who had pressed his forehead to hers in the window light, would find her in the evenings, in whatever room she had migrated to for the day's last task. Not demanding, not performing, just finding her and standing nearby and sometimes putting his hand over hers the way he had at the beginning and being the thing that he had learned, very slowly, how to be present. She was the king's mate. She was the moonblood that the Thornwood Witch had tried to erase. She was the girl who had been handed away on a cart and had arrived, somehow, in a castle that had been waiting for her without knowing it, as had the king inside it. She was not, as she had believed for 20 years, nothing. She was the strength the curse had not accounted for. She was the ground beneath the drowning king's feet. She was the first person in a very long time to press her hand to a door and say, "I am here, and I am not leaving, and I am not afraid." She was Saren. And when the crown was finally placed, in the quiet, pragmatic, ungrand ceremony that suited both of them, with Lord Drev officiating and Marin standing at the side with the expression of someone who has managed a long and difficult situation and is experiencing the specific satisfaction of the thing resolved, she wore it not as something conferred upon her by someone else's power. She wore it as herself. The king, standing beside her, looked at her the way he always looked at her now, steady and real and entirely unglamorous. The look of a man who has been alone for 11 years and found, without planning to find anything, the person who made him want to stop. She looked back at him the same way. Outside, the greywood was bare against a winter sky, and the moon rose cold and clear over the ridge. And for the first time in 11 years, it rose over a castle that did not brace against it. It rose instead over a king who had learned to hold himself, and a queen who had learned to take up space, and the bond between them which the Thornwood curse had tried to use as a weapon and found, instead, to be the one thing it could not break.